When you sign up with the Crimson Fleet, you're in it for the long haul. No one quits. No one retires. The only way out is death. You stay loyal or you pay the consequences. Fleet before friends. Fleet before family. Fleet before yourself.
There is a moment, if you have spent enough time drifting through the outer reaches of the settled systems, when the word pirate begins to feel like it is doing too much work. It does not announce itself. It arrives gradually, the way most honest realizations do, not as a sudden confrontation with the truth, but as a slow accumulation of details that no longer quite fit the frame you brought to them. You notice it in the way a Crimson Fleet vessel adjusts its approach vector, deliberate and unhurried, as though it has all the time in the settled universe. You notice it in the tone of the communication that follows. Not the snarl you might expect, not the reckless aggression of someone who has decided that consequence is someone else's problem, but something measured and almost administrative. A toll, a boundary, a set of expectations that, if met, will allow both parties to go on living. Pirates, historically, don't usually have expectations. They have demands, which is a different thing. Demands are about power in the moment. Expectations are about a relationship over time. And yet, they raid. They ambush freighters in the dark between stars. They leave crews dead in depressurizing hulls for the crime of being in the wrong system at the wrong time with cargo that was worth something to someone. The violence is real, material, and final. People who encounter a Crimson Fleet ambush and do not survive it do not afterwards get to weigh the philosophical nuances of who was hunting them and why. So the question that follows you out of every encounter with the fleet, through the jump points, back along the shipping lanes, into whatever life you were living before they appeared on your sensors, is not whether they are dangerous. They are. The question is whether dangerous and criminal are the same thing as wrong. Whether an organization that commits violence can also be, in some meaningful sense, a legitimate response to something. Whether the settled systems, in its rush to classify the fleet as a criminal enterprise and deploy the full weight of its enforcement architecture against them, has accurately named what it is actually dealing with. Because here is what the United Colonies will never say in an official broadcast. Here is what the Free Star Collective will never acknowledge in any treaty or political communique. Here is what SysDef's operational reports carefully avoid concluding, because the conclusion would be uncomfortable for the institution that funds them. The Crimson Fleet exists because it has to, not because individual people are born bad or make poor choices or fall into lives of crime through weakness of character, but because the settled systems, in the specific and deliberate way it has organized itself, has consistently produced people for whom the fleet is not the worst available option. It is simply the only one that was ever actually offered. That is the question this archive is going to sit with. Not whether the fleet is good, not whether their methods are defensible, but whether they are what we have been told they are. Whether the frame we have been handed is adequate to what it is supposed to contain. To understand the Crimson Fleet, you have to understand the world they grew out of. And the world they grew out of is not the one that gets commemorated in UC museums or celebrated in Freestar Independence Day broadcasts. It is the world that runs underneath that one, the one that operates on the quiet machinery of exclusion, the one that has been carefully made invisible because visibility would require an accounting that none of the available powers are prepared to give. The settled systems, in the period that Starfield's story inhabits, presents itself as humanity's greatest achievement. And, by a meaningful set of metrics, that presentation is not wrong. 250 years after the devastation of Earth, after the slow, catastrophic collapse of the planet humanity had called home, the species did not end. It adapted. It dispersed across dozens of star systems. It built cities on worlds that had no right to support human life, learned to terraform atmospheres, developed gravity-drive technology that turned the incomprehensible distances between stars into something schedulable and planned around. It survived the loss of Earth and did not simply survive. It proliferated, created, endured across the void. The settled systems is, in the most literal sense, a monument to what human beings can accomplish when the alternative is extinction. But survival and flourishing are not the same thing, and the shape of who flourishes in the settled systems, the specific contours of who gets to participate in the abundance that the civilization has created, tells you more about what it actually is than any founding document or political speech. Because every civilization produces, as a function of its organization, people who benefit from it and people who do not. And the more deliberately a civilization has been designed, the more deliberately that division is drawn. The United Colonies is the most powerful political entity in settled space, and it has held that position long enough that its authority has started to feel like nature rather than arrangement. New Atlantis, built on Jemison, is a city that communicates its own legitimacy through sheer scale. The architecture says permanence, says considered design, says this is what civilization looks like when it has time and resources to think carefully about what it is doing. The UC has a functioning government, a professional military, a legal system complex enough to require specialist practitioners, and a civil service that administers it all with the efficiency of institutions that have been refining their procedures for generations of people born into them and committed to them across their careers. What the UC also has, built into the structure of all of that, is a set of assumptions about who belongs in it and who does not. UC citizenship is not simply a legal status. It is a social position, a claim on the resources and protections that the UC provides, and it comes with conditions applied with unequal results to different people in different circumstances. There are pathways to full citizenship and civic participation, but those pathways are navigated more easily by some people than by others, and the people who find them hardest to navigate are not, by and large, the people the pathways were designed with in mind. For people on the margins of UC society, those who failed to meet requirements that were never explained to them, who were disqualified by circumstances they did not choose, who found that the legal system's complexity worked against them rather than for them. It works considerably less well. And the UC's institutional response to those people across the arc of its history has been to regard their difficulty as a personal failing rather than a structural one, to treat the system's exclusion of them as evidence that they were not meant to be included, rather than as evidence that the system has a problem it is not prepared to address. The Free Star Collective presents itself as the ideological counterweight to the UC's centralism, and in many respects, the contrast is genuine. Its founding mythology is the mythology of liberty, the right of individuals to determine their own lives without the interference of a centralized authority. Aquila City wears this mythology comfortably. The aesthetic of the frontier, of building something new in space that older institutions had not yet claimed, has genuine appeal to a specific kind of person, someone capable, self-directed, and with the resources to make independence survivable. Because that is the aspect of Free Star freedom that the mythology tends not to dwell on, its relationship to capital, to material starting conditions, to the reality that freedom in frontier space is meaningful in proportion to your capacity to defend and develop it. Land without the resources to work it is just land. A homestead claim without equipment, supplies, and labor to actualize it is a piece of paper in a system that does not check back to see how it went. And the things that make frontier freedom real rather than notional, ships, weapons, medical supplies, food stores, time to establish yourself before the first crisis, all cost credits, which is to say, they cost everything that Free Star rhetoric treats as irrelevant to the question of freedom. The settlers who thrive in Free Star space are the ones who arrived with enough to make a start and the skills or luck to build on it. The ones who arrived with less, drawn by the same mythology, only to discover it was partly aspirational and partly a retroactive justification of advantages the system's winners already possessed, find themselves in a situation that Free Star ideology is philosophically ill-equipped to address, because addressing it would require acknowledging that their system produces losers as reliably as it produces winners. The ideology of individual freedom does not have a comfortable place for systemic failure, because if freedom is what you make of it, then those who made little of it made too little. The structural explanation is unavailable. Between these two poles, the UC's ordered hierarchy and Free Star's organized self-determination, vast stretches of space exist that neither institution meaningfully governs. Not because the space is physically inaccessible, but because governance requires sustained investment, and investment follows either strategic necessity or profit margin. Systems lacking resources worth developing, shipping lanes connecting minor points, settlements too small to constitute a meaningful tax base. These spaces receive periodic attention and chronic neglect. The people who inhabit them develop their own relationships with authority, which tend to range from indifference to active hostility, because authority, in their experience, has a recognizable pattern. It arrives when something needs extracting and leaves when the extraction is complete. This is the geography that produced the Crimson Fleet, not in the simple sense that poverty generates crime, that reduction is too comfortable, too quick a way to dissolve complexity into a familiar narrative, but in the more specific sense that the fleet represents a coherent response to conditions that the available institutions looked at and decided were not their problem. People do not generally choose to live outside the law out of preference for instability and risk. They choose it because the inside of the law has already demonstrated what it offers them, and what it offers them is not enough. Or, more precisely, it makes clear that they have been assigned to a category whose needs are not what the system is organized around. The settled systems produced the fleet the way any system produces its own outside, by drawing its boundaries in a way that left people on the wrong side, and by declining repeatedly to examine whether the drawing served anyone other than those already inside it. The Crimson Fleet does not have a founding document. No charter exists that articulates its principles. No constitution describes its structure. No declaration names the specific grievances that brought it into being. This absence is sometimes cited as evidence that the fleet is not a real organization in any meaningful sense, that it is simply a loose agglomeration of criminal actors who happen to operate in overlapping territory and share a flag because the flag is useful for recognition purposes rather than because it means anything to the people who fly it. But this reading misunderstands how organizations of necessity form. They rarely form through deliberate founding acts, through a group of people sitting down together and deciding to build something. They form through the gradual accretion of shared interest, shared threat, and shared geography, through the discovery, made individually and then collectively, that the people around you are navigating the same conditions and that coordination is more survivable than isolation. The fleet grew from that discovery. That is the more accurate account of it, not a founding, but an accumulation, a slow gathering of ships and crews and individuals who found each other in the spaces between the settled system's formal boundaries and recognized in each other's presence something that resembled their own situation. The fleet grew during and after the Colony War, a conflict that reorganized the political architecture of the settled systems, with the particular violence of wars fought over who gets to define the rules. The Colony War left authority uncertain in the immediate aftermath, enforcement unreliable, and the corridors of power occupied by people more interested in consolidating what they had won than attending to the spaces the war had disrupted. In those disrupted spaces, in the political equivalent of the moment between one order collapsing and another fully establishing itself, piracy flourished. The conditions were not permanent, but they lasted long enough to allow something like the Crimson Scar, the pirate outfit that eventually became the fleet, to consolidate without being immediately dismantled. By the time the institutions had stabilized enough to pay sustained attention to what was forming in their margins, the problem was larger than they had anticipated. At the center of it was Jasper Kryx. The name carries a weight that real historical figures rarely accumulate in their own lifetimes, assigned retroactively by the movements that needed to anchor themselves to something larger than the present moment. Kryx is, in the way that founding myths always are, both more and less than what he actually was. More because the fleet has placed on him the full weight of its own legitimacy. Every choice validated by the tradition he began, every hardship made meaningful by belonging to a story that started with him. Less because the actual person, with his specific motivations and compromises and the particular way his story ended, has been almost entirely replaced by the symbolic figure, who exists now mainly to represent things rather than to be someone. What the historical record shows is this: Jasper Kryx was not a political dissident or a visionary reformer. He was a pirate captain who clawed his way up from small-time crime in New Atlantis, eventually killing the previous leader of the Crimson Scar and taking command of the outfit. When the UC Navy finally caught him, they sentenced him to life in the Lock, a maximum security prison on the surface of Suvorov, a cold and hostile ice planet chosen, one imagines, for its discouragement value. In 2241, 5 years into his sentence, Kryx instigated a riot. He and his fellow inmates had secretly tunneled their way to the prison armory. Fully armed, they overwhelmed the guards, commandeered ships from the hangar, and turned their attention to the station orbiting above them. The key was a UC security star station, not built by the fleet, not retrofitted from neutral infrastructure, but a functioning piece of UC military architecture that Kryx and his escaped prisoners assaulted and seized. That seizure is the founding act of the Crimson Fleet. Not a political decision, not a manifesto, not even a plan so much as an opportunity. There was a station, and they took it, and then they had a base. And having a base meant they could build something that hadn't existed before. That the system bearing his name became the fleet's permanent home is not coincidence. It is a statement made by every fleet member who says they are from the Kryx System. This space belongs to those who claimed it from outside the permission structure of the institutions that claim to own everything. Whether Kryx intended that statement, or whether the fleet projected it onto him after the fact, is one of the more interesting questions the myth raises, and does not answer. What we can say is that the fleet finds the statement useful, which may be the more important thing. The key today is not what Kryx captured. It is what the fleet has made of what it captured, and that difference is visible in its structure. The original bones of the UC station are still there in its foundational geometry, overlaid with generations of additions and modifications representing specific moments of necessity. A docking bay expanded because more ships arrived than the original design anticipated. A communication array upgraded because the threat evolved, and the ability to monitor that threat had to evolve with it. Corridors added because the population grew, and space had to be made for the growing, section by section. Walking through the key. And if you have spent time earning the fleet's trust, you have walked those corridors. Listen to the particular hum of a station that is always, on some level, oriented toward the possibility that it will need to defend itself. You feel the accumulated weight of everyone who has passed through it. The station is a kind of archive, rendered not in records, but in structure. Every weld and patch and retrofitted component is evidence of a decision made under pressure, with limited resources, to keep this thing alive for one more day. The key has been kept alive for a very long time. That, in itself, is a form of argument about what the fleet is capable of. The code that governs behavior within the fleet emerged from the conditions of that survival, and it is observed with more seriousness than you might expect from an organization that the UC classifies, without nuance, as organized crime. Fleet members do not steal from each other. This is the most fundamental rule, the one that sits beneath all the others, because theft within the fleet is not simply a crime against an individual, It is a betrayal of the premise that makes the fleet possible. An organization of people who cannot trust each other has no organizing principle that will hold under pressure. If you cannot rely on the people who share your station and your sky, you cannot build anything that lasts, and the fleet has to last against forces that are continuously working to end it. Beyond the prohibition on internal theft, a broader network of informal obligation extends through the fleet. The sharing of intelligence about UC patrol patterns, the extension of safe harbor to fleet ships in distress, the maintenance of something like solidarity across vessels and crews that may never have met in person, but that recognize in each other a shared membership in something that the outside world wants to eliminate. This network functions because everyone in it has a stake in its functioning, because the alternative to mutual support in space that is already hostile to human life and additionally hostile to people the UC considers criminals is isolation. And isolation is simply a slower kind of death. The code does not make the fleet good. It makes the fleet functional and coherent. But it also means that the fleet is not simply a collection of individuals who happen to operate criminally in the same region of space. It is a community with genuine social bonds and genuine obligations, and the word pirate cannot contain both the violence and the community simultaneously. It can only contain one. The ideology that the fleet has built around itself, the story it tells about what it is and why it exists, centers on freedom. This word does more work in fleet culture than almost any other, and understanding what it actually means to the people who use it requires separating several different ideas that tend to get compressed together, because compression is more useful than precision when you are trying to hold an organization together across people with very different histories and very different reasons for being where they are. There is, first, the freedom of absence. This is the most immediately comprehensible version, and it is the one most often described by fleet members who talk about why they came. The absence of the specific constraints that made life intolerable in the places they came from. The UC citizen who could not navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth of the citizenship advancement system, who hit the same wall the same way enough times that continuing to try felt more like a commitment to a humiliation ritual than a reasonable strategy for improving their circumstances. The Freestar settler who arrived with enough to begin and not enough to survive the first hard season, who watched their land claim be contested by a corporate entity with a legal team that cost more per day than the settler had saved in their life. The ship's crew member who discovered that the protections the company advertised in its employment materials did not apply in the specific situation where protection was needed. For these people, the freedom the fleet offers is not a political abstraction. It is the concrete physical experience of no longer being subject to a system that was clearly built around the interests of someone other than them. The relief of that experience is real. It does not require a political education to feel. There is, second, the freedom of belonging. And this version is harder to articulate, which is perhaps why it is more often overlooked in discussions of the fleet, despite being the most durable thing the organization provides. The people who end up at the key are people who have, in one way or another, been told by the available social structures that they are a problem to be managed rather than a person to be received. Their presence creates complications. The institution would function more smoothly without them. They do not fit the category, the requirement, the expectation. And the fleet takes these people and provides a context in which not fitting the outside world is not a deficit, but a qualification, the shared condition of everyone present, the thing that makes the community rather than the thing that excludes from it. The relief this produces is specific and profound, and it creates loyalty of a kind that institutional affiliation rarely generates, because it is loyalty to a place that received you rather than a place that simply tolerated your presence in exchange for your utility. There is, third, the freedom of ideology, the political argument that the fleet's existence constitutes a legitimate form of resistance to illegitimate power. This version is the fleet's most ambitious claim about itself, and it is the one that Naeva Mora articulates most clearly and believes most genuinely. The idea that the UC's authority is not authority in any meaningful moral sense, but domination dressed in administrative language, that the Freestar Collective's freedom is freedom in name rather than substance for people without the capital to actualize it, and that the fleet's refusal of both represents not mere criminality, but principled dissent, a coherent response to a civilization that has failed deliberately and repeatedly to be what it claims to be. This version of fleet freedom is also the one most frequently deployed in the fleet's internal culture to justify choices that would otherwise require more uncomfortable justifications, which tells you something about the difference between ideology as genuine belief and ideology as institutional maintenance. Because here is what the fleet's ideological self-image requires, that its operational reality not be examined too closely. The freedom that the ideology describes is a freedom from a specific kind of oppression, institutional oppression, the oppression of systems that exclude and marginalize and grind people down, with the particular indifference that systems have when the people being ground down are not the people the systems were designed to serve. The fleet's rhetoric positions its violence as violence against that oppression, as the cost of refusing to accept a situation that deserves refusing. But the fleet's actual violence, the raids, the extortion, the ambushes in the shipping lanes, is not directed exclusively or even primarily at the institutions it claims to oppose. The ships that get raided are not, in the main, warships or government vessels or corporate freighters belonging to the companies that exploit the frontier and then retreat to the safety of UC law when things go wrong. They are often small operators, independent crews, the same category of person who might, in different circumstances, have ended up at the quay rather than at the wrong end of a fleet boarding action. The people who pay the fleet's costs in blood and cargo and terror are not the UC. They are people who are simply present in the space the fleet has decided to tax. This gap between the fleet's ideological self-image and its operational reality is the central tension that its members manage with varying degrees of success. Some manage it by refusing to examine it, by keeping the ideology in one compartment and the operational reality in another, maintaining enough separation that the contradiction never quite becomes explicit. This is the most common approach, and the one that requires the least energy. Others manage it by genuinely believing that the harm the fleet causes is calibrated against the harm it opposes. That in a universe where the powerful have always imposed their costs on the powerless, the fleet is simply complicating the direction of the imposition. And some manage it by holding the ideology with enough sincerity that the disconfirming evidence keeps arriving a fraction of a second too late to settle cleanly against it. What none of this resolves is whether an organization can be simultaneously a legitimate response to structural injustice and a perpetrator of genuine harm to people who are not themselves responsible for that injustice. The fleet presents itself as though these two things are separable, as though one can acknowledge the harm while affirming the legitimacy of the response that caused it. The people who are harmed by fleet raids would tell you, with considerable justification, that these two things are not separable from where they are standing. And the space between those two positions, between the fleet's self-understanding and the experience of the people it damages, is one of the most honest places to look if you want to understand what the fleet actually is. You cannot understand what the fleet is in the abstract. You have to understand it through the specific people who have shaped it, because institutions are the accumulated weight of the decisions made by the people who hold authority within them, and those decisions reveal things that mission statements and ideological declarations deliberately obscure. Delgado commands the Crimson Fleet at this moment in its history, and everything about the way he carries that command tells you something important about what the fleet has become. He is, by any honest account, formidable. The kind of person who reads a room before he enters it and has already determined what he wants from the conversation before the first word is spoken. His authority in the fleet is not performed. It is the natural result of someone genuinely capable operating in an environment that rewards demonstrated capability with accumulated trust. The fleet respects Delgado because he has repeatedly made the decisions that kept the organization viable when other decisions would have made it dead. That track record builds something more reliable than loyalty. It builds the assumption that the person who was right in the past will be right in the present, which is both more durable than ordinary loyalty and more dangerous, because assumptions outlast the conditions that generated them. What Delgado's leadership reveals, when you watch it over time and from close enough to see past the performance, is that his relationship to the fleet's stated principles is instrumental rather than constitutive. He speaks the language of fleet freedom with complete fluency, and he speaks it at precisely the moments when it will produce the results he is looking for. But the freedom he is most deeply committed to is his own freedom to pursue his vision of what the fleet should be and what it should accomplish in the world. And that vision, when you examine it without the ideological overlay, is not a vision of collective liberation. It is a vision of power, specifically the particular form of power that would allow Delgado to operate in the settled systems without the constant threat of being dismantled by a larger institutional force. This is a comprehensible desire. It is, in certain lights, an understandable one. It is also a desire that has very little to do with the emancipatory politics the fleet wraps around itself like armor against the cold. The distinction between a revolutionary and a warlord is not always legible from the inside, and the fleet under Delgado's leadership is, at any given moment in its recent history, positioned somewhere on the spectrum between those two things. The specific position is determined by what Delgado decides it should be, which is itself part of the problem, because an organization whose ethical position is determined by its leader's calculation has not actually transcended the logic of power it claims to oppose. Naeva Mora occupies a fundamentally different place in fleet culture, and her difference from Delgado is one of the most illuminating things about both of them. She is not, despite what fleet mythology might prefer, a true believer in the political project of liberation. Naeva was born in Neon and orphaned young, a city that produces, among other things, a very particular understanding of how the world is organized and who it is organized for. She grew up in crime across both UC and Freestar space, was frequently arrested, did time in SysDef prisons, and by her early 20s had developed into something the official records describe as ruthless, and the fleet's own people experience daily. Someone who understands power as the only real currency, and who is extraordinarily good at accumulating it. What Naeva believes in is not the fleet as a liberatory project. She believes in the fleet as a vehicle for profit, for autonomy, for the specific kind of standing that comes from being feared rather than ignored. She controls her subordinates through a precise combination of threat and manipulation, and she maintains her position not through charisma or ideology, but through the reliable application of consequences. The official fleet mythology of freedom and resistance does not particularly interest her. More pointedly, she is openly skeptical of the Kryx legend itself, viewing it as a story useful for inspiring new recruits and dressing up what is, in her estimation, a practical criminal operation as something grander than it is. This is, in a strange way, more honest than most of what the fleet says about itself. Naeva sees the organization without the myth attached, and what she sees is an organization that should grow its power through conventional piracy, smuggling, and extortion, the things it actually does well, rather than chasing a legend that has killed everyone who chased it seriously. That her pragmatism sits alongside genuine loyalty to Delgado and genuine protection of people she has claimed for her own. Her relationship with Jasmine Durand, the mechanic who keeps the key running, is the closest thing Naeva has to a human attachment, suggests that the ruthlessness is a mode rather than the entirety of the person. But it is the dominant mode, and the fleet operates in its shadow. What makes her presence in the fleet's leadership philosophically significant is exactly this absence of ideology. If Delgado represents the fleet's aspirational self-image, the dreamer who wants to build something historically worthy, then Naeva represents the fleet as it actually functions day to day, pragmatic, acquisitive, coercive, and largely uninterested in the story it tells about why those things are justified. She is the fleet without the narrative. And the fleet without the narrative is, in the end, something closer to what its critics say it is than what its members believe it to be. Below the level of command, the fleet is composed of people who do not spend much time on these questions, not because they are incapable of engaging with them, but because the immediate demands of life in the fleet leave relatively little space for ideology. There are ships to maintain, routes to memorize, patrol schedules to analyze, supply chains to keep intact, and the constant background awareness that UC SysDef would prefer all of this to cease existing. The fleet's rank and file live in the operational present. Their relationship to fleet identity is built primarily out of belonging and solidarity, and the specific texture of a daily life that has, against considerable odds, become something sustainable. They are not leaders managing their own contradictions, and they are not ideologues maintaining a vision under pressure. They are people who came here for specific reasons. Some of those reasons genuinely political, some of them rooted in desperation, some of them in violence that closed other doors permanently, and who have found in this place something resembling a life. When you spend time with them in the corridors of the quay or in the tentative hospitality the fleet extends to those it has chosen to trust, what you hear is not a manifesto. You hear something quieter, relief at being somewhere that does not require them to perform a version of themselves that they cannot sustain. Relief at being among people who know what they are without requiring a justification or an apology, because everyone present has the same answer to the question of how they arrived, which is to say, through some combination of the system's failures and their own choices, by a route that did not feel like a choice at the time, even when technically it was. That relief is real. It is worth something. It does not redeem the violence, and it does not answer for the people who died in fleet raids. But it tells you something true about what the fleet has become for the people inside it, something that exists alongside the violence, in the same organization, complicating the story in a direction that neither the fleet's self-image nor the UC's official narrative is equipped to handle. And then there is the legacy. The name drifts through fleet culture with the quality of something sacred. And like most sacred things, its power comes less from what it demonstrably is than from what the people who need it require it to mean. The fleet's rank and file understand Kryx's legacy as the final proof of the founding story. Evidence that Jasper Kryx was not simply a prisoner who got lucky in a riot, but a visionary who reached further than anyone around him, who found the biggest score in settled space and left it, deliberately, strategically, for the fleet that bore his name to eventually claim. That belief has sustained itself for decades in the absence of any evidence for it. It has survived repeated failed attempts to locate the ship. Myths survive this way when people need them enough to maintain them, adjusting the story as required to keep it coherent. The actual history of Kryx's legacy is, like most sacred things encountered in their factual form, more specific and more ambivalent than the mythology managed. The legacy is not a ship Jasper Kryx owned or built. It is a GalBank transport vessel, a large, heavily secured cargo carrier making a transit across settled space while carrying an almost incomprehensible sum in credits. These were not ordinary funds. They were colony war reparations, money the United Colonies owed the Free Star Collective as payment for the damage the war had inflicted, a financial settlement meant to draw a line under decades of conflict and begin something that might eventually resemble peace. The irony embedded in the legacy's history is the kind that requires a moment to absorb. The credits meant as the literal price of peace were seized by Jasper Kryx during the transit and have been unavailable ever since, sitting in the dark at the center of a myth. The peace payment that never arrived. Funds for reconciliation, frozen in orbit around a storm planet, waiting. Kryx attacked the Legacy during its voyage, destroying its escort vessels and disabling its engines. The ship, thrown off course, ended up drifting into the orbit of Bannoc IV, a planet whose electromagnetic field makes any approach with standard equipment fatal to the attempting vessel. The crew, stranded with no engines and no prospect of rescue, managed to rig the Cred tank's own electromagnetic shielding into a protection system for the entire ship, an improvisation that preserved both vessel and credits against the EM storm while doing nothing for the people inside it. Most of the crew died of starvation. The last two took their own lives. The Legacy became a ghost ship, inaccessible, intact, carrying its fortune. Kryx spent years working toward it. He built a custom electromagnetic shield for his own vessel, and eventually returned to the Legacy to claim what the raid had left unreachable. What the mythology does not dwell on is what happened when he got there. His second-in-command, Issa Milan, had sabotaged his ship. The electromagnetic field destroyed the Erebos as Kryx boarded the Legacy, leaving him stranded on the very ship he had spent years trying to reach. He survived for a time in the vault control room, long enough to leave recordings, and then died of starvation alone, surrounded by more credits than any pirate in the settled systems had ever accumulated in one place. His corpse is still in the vault when the Legacy is finally reached. This is the detail that the mythology skips over most completely, because it does not fit the heroic register the founding story requires. Jasper Kryx, the figure whose name is spoken on the key as though it carries moral authority, whose prison break is the fleet's origin story, whose legacy has been the organizing obsession of every fleet generation since, died exactly the way he left so many others, alone in a dark ship, with no one coming to help. The betrayal that ended him came from inside the organization he had built. The great score became the great trap. What the Legacy actually contains, when it is finally reached, is credits, the largest single cache of liquid wealth in the settled systems outside a major financial institution. And this is the weight of it, not the weight of a weapon, but the weight of economic power sufficient to fundamentally change what the fleet can become. Delgado understands this precisely. His obsession with Kryx's legacy is not sentimental, whatever mythological language he uses around it. What he sees is the financial leverage to unite the fleet's loose confederation of independent pirate captains under a single banner with real resources behind it, to elevate the organization from a persistent criminal nuisance into something the UC has to treat as a genuine strategic peer rather than an enforcement problem. This ambition is coherent in its own terms. It is also revealing in a way that Delgado may not intend, because what he wants to build with Kryx's legacy is not liberation or the creation of an alternative to available power structures. It is a better funded version of exactly the kind of power the fleet has always defined itself against. Centralized, capable of projecting force at scale, operating from a position of financial strength that makes it impossible to ignore. The credits don't buy freedom in any meaningful sense. They buy the ability to impose costs on others from a position of greater strength. That the fleet has always called this freedom says something precise about the gap between the word and what it names in practice. Naeva, for her part, remains skeptical of the entire Legacy project even as it unfolds. She thinks the hunt for Kryx's treasure has always been a distraction, a story useful for inspiring dreamers, less useful for running an organization that survives by doing practical criminal work. Her pragmatism is, in this instance, both correct about the risks and blind to what the Legacy's recovery might actually mean for the fleet's position in the settled systems. The tension between Delgado's vision and Naeva's skepticism is, in miniature, the tension that runs through the entire organization, between what the fleet says it is reaching for and what the daily work of being the fleet actually looks like. Kryx died alone in the vault he spent his life trying to reach, betrayed by someone he trusted. This fact sits quietly inside the myth, almost entirely unused, because the myth does not know what to do with it. It suggests that the founding figure of the Crimson Fleet encountered the same thing that the fleet's victims encounter, that people inside the organization are capable of doing to one another exactly what the fleet does to the outside world. What this implies, if we follow it through, is that the fleet has never been the community of mutual trust and shared purpose that its internal culture insists it is. It has always been, as Naeva perhaps understands more clearly than anyone, a hierarchy of power where trust extends only as far as control, and where betrayal is always available to anyone who calculates that the moment is right. Here is what you are left with when you have followed all of it through to wherever it goes. The Crimson Fleet is not simply pirates. That word is too small for what they are, too convenient for those who apply it, too easily satisfied with the surface of a thing that has more depth than the surface reveals. The word closes the inquiry before it opens, names the thing in a way that tells you that naming is sufficient, that the question has been answered by the categorization and no further examination is required. But the inquiry is not closed by the name. It only appears to be. The fleet operates criminally. That remains factually true, and it should not be minimized. People are harmed by its actions. Ships are taken. Lives end in the space between stars because someone in a fleet vessel made a choice to attack rather than to pass. None of this is deniable, and the people it happens to deserve to have it acknowledged without qualification or softening. The harm is real, regardless of what explains it. But the fleet is also an answer. Flawed, morally compromised, internally contradictory, but a genuine answer to the question of what happens when a civilization organizes itself in a way that excludes substantial numbers of people and then declines to examine why the exclusion keeps producing the same results. The excluded people do not disappear. They do not accept the terms and quietly suffer in ways that do not disturb the order. They find other arrangements. They build outside the structure that would not have them. And what they build takes the shape of what was available to them, which in the settled systems, at this moment in its history, looks like the Crimson Fleet, a community formed from the wreckage of other communities, sustained by bonds that the outside world declined to provide, and that the people inside built themselves through necessity and alongside violence, across decades of choosing to persist rather than dissolve. Jasper Kryx, whatever the real person underneath the legend, represents something in fleet culture that is not false, even if the biography carrying it has been shaped by its own use. The idea that the terms offered by power are not the only available terms, that it is possible to refuse those terms and create a different arrangement in the spaces they have not yet colonized, is a real idea, and it does real work for the people who have organized their lives around it. The UC's authority depends on the premise that the available choices are adequate, that anyone who finds themselves outside them has failed personally rather than been failed structurally. The fleet's existence is, at minimum, evidence against that premise. It is not comfortable evidence, and it does not arrive without costs. But it is evidence. The legacy is what happens when that idea encounters the full weight of its own history. The founder's final score, millions of credits intended as peace money, frozen in a dead ship in a storm system, is not a weapon. It is something the fleet may find more destabilizing, a mirror, because the choice of what to do with Kryx's legacy is ultimately the choice of what the fleet is. Credits are power, and power does not liberate by its nature. It reorganizes who holds the advantage. If the legacy funds the fleet's expansion into something that rivals the major powers, it raises the question that Naeva, for all her pragmatism, never seems to ask. Expansion toward what? Dominance dressed in different colors is still dominance. And the fleet, for all its mythology of freedom and defiance, has never entirely resolved the question of what it would build if it won, rather than simply what it would refuse. Revolutions fail in many ways. They fail by being crushed before they can become anything. They fail by winning and then replicating, in the exercise of their own power, the logic they define themselves against. And they fail by never resolving the question of whether they were revolutions at all, whether the project was liberation, or whether it was power seeking a different configuration, arriving at a familiar destination by an unfamiliar road. The Crimson Fleet has not resolved that question. It lives inside it. So return to the beginning. Return to that moment when the word pirate started to feel insufficient. The reason it felt insufficient was never that the fleet is secretly virtuous. It felt insufficient because the word was designed to end the conversation, to classify and thereby close, to name the thing in a way that removes the need to look further. Looking further does not exonerate anyone. It does not dissolve the harm into abstraction or make the violence philosophical rather than real. What it does is reveal the shape of something that the name was hiding, the outline of a civilization that produces its own negation, that builds into its structure the very forces that oppose it, and then expresses genuine surprise when those forces resist being eliminated. The fleet exists because the settled systems made choices, repeated, considered, maintained choices about who belongs in the structure and who does not. It will continue to exist in some form until those choices change, or until it reshapes itself into something indistinguishable from what it began by opposing, funded by the credits that were meant to pay for peace, led by a man whose ambition mirrors the institutional ambitions he claims to resist, watched over by a second-in-command who sees through the mythology and simply wants more of what the fleet already is. That outcome would be, in its way, the most complete version of the story. Not a defeat, but a transformation. The organization that began as a refusal of power becoming, through the slow machinery of success, another expression of it. The question that stays is not what the fleet is, it is what it reveals. About the civilization it opposes, about the civilization it might build if it won, and about the distance between those two, a distance that might be very small or might be everything. This archive holds many things. The answers are not always here, but the questions always are, and questions are what keep us looking. Stay with us in the dark between the stars.